Thank you. Buttering me up. I understand I'm the first to use an iPad as the reading device, which I think is going to sweep the nation. As Deborah said, I've been mostly editing. Let's see if I can hook into your wireless network while I'm here. I've been mostly editing the last couple of years.
You need this to be higher?
It would be better.
Just makes it easier if you're reading from your iPad.
Yes, sure it does. Thank you. So I've been mostly editing the last couple of years, but every once in a while the spirit moves me and I demand to write something down. And last year I wrote this very short piece, and it got placed in the Sunday New York Times during the I guess it was a year ago when Ford Motor Company announced that they were closing the Mercury make of automobile, which is something that very few people cared about. And I thought, this is the perfect niche topic that there's probably only 4 or 5 people on the planet who can write something of any interest about. And I was convinced I was called. So this is a short piece about that, and because of the synchronicity with the title, Deborah had asked me to read it here. And what I'm learning is that the power of this screen and the power of the lights over my head is battling somewhat, but I will prevail. This week, the Ford Motor Company officially shut down its 71-year-old Mercury division, a decision that was met with, well, perhaps even indifference, maybe too strong a word. To be honest, we don't feel a thing, wrote the automotive journalist Sam Smith on the car blog Jalopnik. Do you care? Does Ford? Does anyone? I cared. The brand had been rattling along on fumes for years, offering a dwindling lineup of copycat Fusions and renamed Explorers to those buyers who were willing to pay a little bit more for slightly different grills and taillights. The archetypal Mercury, and its best-selling product of late, was the giant Grand Marquis, or Grandma, a living fossil of a car whose design dated to the early 1970s and whose spirit harkened to a long-gone era of American motoring, the age of the living room you could drive. For a long time now, Mercury seemed to exist mainly because Ford could not muster the energy to kill it. Named for the swift and wily Roman messenger of the gods, it died a rolling symbol of corporate torpor and irrelevance. But Mercury used to mean something, at least in my family. Dad was a Mercury man. From the late 1960s to the mid-1980s, we had a driveway full of the things. This was during the division's commercial zenith. In 1978, more than 500,000 Mercuries were sold. Still, you never really saw that very many of them on the roads, even in those days, which may have explained my family's curious devotion to this unassuming brand. This was a time when buying what we used to call a, quote, foreign car could be a leap into the exotic unknown. 9 out of 10 cars on the road in the early 1970s were domestically produced. Today, that number is less than 40%. In this all-American context, choosing a Mercury made a statement of measured individuality. It was just a plain Ford, of course, but a little different, a little classier, a little more expensive. A Mercury said you were going somewhere, or you wanted to, and you were going your own way. Henry Ford's son, Edsel, the Cheyenne with the ill-starred name, dreamed up the Mercury division at the tail end of the Depression as a bridge between the lunch pail Ford and the luxury Lincolns. But Mercury only seemed to hit its stride in the 1950s with the arrival of an American middle class that could respond to its gently aspirational message. My father was a Midwesterner of modest means who had reinvented himself as an academic at Eastern universities. He might have been the ideal Mercury personality, a careful man at midlife who was building a family and surrounding it with just slightly better things. It would have been impossible to imagine him at the helm of some chrome-encrusted Cadillac or giant Lincoln Mark V, even if he could have afforded one. Still, when he was promoted to full professor, he sought subtle automotive validation. So out went the Plymouth Valiant with the chewed-up interior. Up pulled a pair of 1970 Mercuries, a top-of-the-line Colony Park station wagon, and a green Cougar coupe with a vinyl roof. The station wagon was as long and black and distinguished as a presidential limousine. The Cougar of that era was a slightly stretched Mustang. The ad men called it a, quote, gentleman's muscle car. It had a flamboyant swoop along its ample flanks and hideaway headlights that gave it a mysterious hooded gaze, as if it knew something that you didn't. As a child, I spent hours sitting in that car, pushing the AM radio buttons and twisting the silvery knobs. Later, Dad would let me back it out of the garage and sit behind the wheel in the driveway as the big 351 V8 rumbled contentedly. Growing up as a Mercury fan was a lonely road in the mid-1970s. The pop culture penetration of this brand was just about nil. The only Mercury you were likely to see on television was on Hawaii Five-0, where Jack Lord would drive a black Park Lane Brougham four-door through the streets of Honolulu. The Park Lane looked like the kind of anonymous rectangular car that comic book artists draw in the background of crime stories. The perfect undercover ride for a detective looking to lie low. No other kids I knew had parents with Mercuries. But brand loyalty meant something in those days, so when rust ate up the Colony Park, an overfed-looking Montego Villager wagon took its place. And in the 1980s came a flimsy Zephyr and the only slightly more substantial Marquis. This was not an auspicious time for American car manufacturers, and neither of these undersized vehicles had the presence of their older counterparts. Indeed, they looked almost identical to the cheaper Ford twins. And Dad eventually moved on to full-size Oldsmobiles and Buicks late in life, as so many of his generation did, and still do today. The disappearance of the Mercury brand would likely have passed more or less unnoticed had my father been alive to witness it. It had been some time since the name meant anything to him, if indeed it ever really did. But that was part of Mercury's stealthy anti-appeal. It said that you cared about quality, but not so much that you expected anyone else to notice. This is a difficult message for any consumer product to convey, even in the best of times. And Ford's decision to return to its Depression-era configuration, with basic Fords for the masses and blingy Lincolns for the 1%, is probably the way to go, considering the growing gulf between those two sides of American society. Perhaps it's too much to expect many people to mourn the death of the middle-brow brand in between. But let's at least take a moment to wave farewell to the vanishing class of Americans who once drove these cars, the modest drivers who aimed not for the best, but the good enough.